The call came in just after sunrise, while I was pouring my first cup of coffee in the tiny ranger station. The radio cracked with static, then a shaky voice pushed through, talking way too fast about a bear, a bridge, and a drop that looked like forever. I set the mug down so hard it sloshed over my hand. For a second I thought I had misheard. Then the dispatcher repeated it slowly, forcing every word out. Hikers spotted a black bear stuck on the old suspension bridge over Dry Creek Canyon. The middle span looks like it collapsed. They think she is hanging partly over the edge. My chest tightened. That bridge had been closed for years. Locals still used it sometimes as a shortcut, even though the sign said otherwise. I grabbed my pack. Harness, one coil of climbing rope, a small first aid kit, flare, extra radio batteries. I did not bother finishing the coffee. My name is Owen, and most days I help with paperwork and small rescues, stuck deer in fences, raccoons in trash cans. This did not sound small. On the drive out, the sky over the mountains looked clean and calm, a bright blue that did not match the knot in my gut. The dirt road twisted through pines and firs, climbing toward the canyon. My truck rattled over washboards while I rehearsed basic rules in my head. Do not corner a bear. Give it space. Never step on anything you are not sure will hold. About half a mile from the bridge, I lost the last bars of cell service. The forest closed in, and the air grew cooler. I killed the engine at the old trailhead and listened. Somewhere far below, water roared through the canyon. I radioed in that I was on foot and alone. Backup was at least 40 minutes out. That was if they left right away. The trail to the bridge is short but steep. I jogged the first part, and then slowed when the trees thinned and I started to hear something other than the river. A sound I know too well from other calls. High, sharp cries. Not human. Bear cubs. My legs suddenly felt heavier. If there were cubs, there was a mother, and if the mother was the one stuck on that bridge, things were worse than the dispatcher realized. The old suspension bridge came into view all at once when the trail rounded the last stand of trees. For a moment I just stopped. The middle of the bridge had dropped out. Several planks dangled on torn cables, swaying over the canyon like broken teeth. In the middle of that mess hung a massive black bear, chest and head over the edge, front paws clawing at empty air. Her back legs were still on what remained of the planks, but they were split and sagging, one end already tilted toward the drop. A harness of frayed rope circled her body. At first I thought someone had tried to pull her up and given up, but then I recognized the pattern. Old research gear from when the bridge was still used to track animal crossings. Somehow she had gotten tangled in it. She groaned, low and rough, and the sound cut right through me. Every time she shifted, the broken boards under her hind legs creaked and snapped a little more. Across the canyon, on the far slope, two small shapes paced the tree-line, crying. Tiny black bear cubs, barely higher than the brush. They moved back and forth, not daring to step onto the bridge, their voices raw and panicked. For a few seconds, all I could do was stare, feeling the height under my own feet, even though I was still on solid ground. The drop beneath that bridge had to be more than 200 feet. If she went over, there would not be a second chance. I forced myself to breathe, one step at a time. First, I needed to check how much of the near side of the bridge was still solid. Then I had to find a way to secure both her and myself. I called in on the radio, keeping my voice low. I see the bear. She is a large adult female, partially fallen through the missing section. Two cubs on the opposite ridge. The bridge is unstable, but I am going to test the first few planks. My hand was slick on the radio, and I had to wipe it on my pants. The reply came with more static than words, but I caught the important part. Do not take unnecessary risks. Wait for backup if it looks too dangerous. I looked up at the bear again. One of her hind paws slipped a few inches, was splintered, and her body dropped just enough to make the cables shudder. The cubs screamed across the canyon. Waiting did not feel like an option. I clipped my harness to the single safety line I had brought, anchored it around the thickest pine near the trail, and tested the pull with my full weight. The rope held. My legs still did not want to move. All right, Owen, I told myself. One plank, then one more. I stepped onto the first board of the bridge, listening to the groan of old wood and the rushing river far below, and started toward the trapped bear. The first plank held my weight, but it dipped just enough to make my stomach twist. I shifted slowly, letting the rope at my waist take a little tension. The bear watched me from the middle of the broken span, her sides rising and falling in short, panicked breaths. Every few seconds, she tried to pull herself forward, and every time the planks under her hind legs moaned like they were ready to snap clean through. I kept my voice low, almost a whisper. "Easy now. I am not here to hurt you." She did not understand, but the tone seemed to matter. Her growling quieted, though her claws still scraped uselessly at the edge. My boots moved inch by inch as I tested each board. Some were solid enough, others sagged so badly I had to step over them. The cables above my head trembled when the wind picked up, and every sway reminded me how little held the two of us above the canyon. Halfway to her, I felt a sudden crack under my heel and froze. A sliver of wood shot downward, spinning into the void. I eased my weight forward, heart pounding, until my boot reached the next plank. For a moment, the image of yesterday came back so sharply it stole my focus. I had been on patrol a few miles south, following a faint trail down to a creek. The mud there still held clean tracks from a large female bear and two much smaller prints beside them. I remember crouching, touching the imprint with my fingers, feeling the soft edges that meant the tracks were fresh. Maybe an hour old. I had even smiled a little. A mother with cubs making her usual rounds. Nothing unusual. If I had followed the tracks farther uphill, maybe I would have noticed the direction they were headed. Maybe someone would have fixed the bridge sooner. The thought hit like a stone in my throat. A sudden groan snapped me back. The bear shifted again, pushing her front paws against the hanging boards, trying to get leverage. One of the planks beneath her hind legs slid an inch, dangling now by only a wire. Not good. Not good at all. All right, Owen, stay focused. I got low, gripping the board with one hand as I reached the edge of the broken section. The gap beneath her body was wide enough to see straight down to the river, white and fast. Her weight kept dragging her forward. Instinct told her to climb, but there was nothing left for her paws to catch. I needed to get a rope around her torso, something to keep her from sliding farther. The old research harness stuck around her midsection was useless. It pulled her downward rather than adding support. I whispered again, more for myself. Just a few more feet. I uncoiled the rope, looping it in one hand as I stepped onto the last mostly stable plank before the drop. It bowed dangerously, and my heel tilted toward the opening. The rope at my waist tightened as my body leaned backward, and for a second I thought the anchor might fail. But it held. The bear twisted toward me, eyes wide, muzzle trembling. She let out a guttural sound full of fear, not aggression. Behind her, her cubs cried from the ridge, their voices thin and desperate. "Easy, girl. Stay still." I slid the rope under the nearest support cable, using it as a brace to get closer to her flank. The wooden boards beneath us groaned with every move. I could feel the vibrations in my knees. When I finally reached her side, I worked quickly. I looped the rope around the thickest part of her chest, threading it behind her shoulder. She flinched hard, nearly pulling me off balance, but I dug my boots into the plank, letting the rope at my waist counter the movement. "There you go. Just hold on." I cinched the rope, not tight enough to hurt her, just enough to create something solid I could pull against. My hands shook from adrenaline and the cold air blowing through the canyon. As I checked the knot for the second time, the bear tried again to lift her front half. Her claws raked wood, catching nothing. The board under her hind left leg snapped with a sharp pop, dropping another few inches. The whole bridge tilted slightly toward the void. I felt the shift in my spine. If one more plank failed, she would slide right through the gap. The rope might keep her from falling all the way, but it might also drag me with her if the anchor didn't hold. I leaned in, bracing my shoulder under part of her weight, and spoke quietly. "Help is coming, but until they get here, I have you. Just do not make any sudden moves." Her breathing slowed for a moment, deep and trembling, and I felt her massive frame settle just enough that I could plant my boots again. Now the real work would begin. For a moment, neither of us moved. The rope I had cinched around her chest held steady, but every fiber of my body could feel how close everything was to giving out. The planks beneath her hind legs had reached their limit. One more shift, and she would drop straight through the gap. The roar of the river below rose and fell with the gusts of wind pushing through the canyon. It made it hard to think. Harder still to hear if the cables overhead were straining or if it was just my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I checked the knot one more time, tugging it with both hands. The bear flinched, pressing her weight into me, and the whole bridge dipped a few inches toward the opening. My boots slid half an inch across the board. "Easy, girl. Stay with me." Her chest rose and fell, faster now. The cubs called again from the ridge, and she answered with a deep, broken groan that made her body twist in a way the bridge could not handle. That was when I heard the sound I had been dreading. A sharp snap above my head. Not wood. Cable. One of the old side ropes. Thin, sun-faded, more decorative than functional. Split down the center. It whipped upward, the freed and slapping the air like a warning. The bridge lurched a few inches downward on the left, pulling my balance with it. I dropped to one knee and grabbed the nearest plank. My rope harness yanked tight at my waist, catching me before I toppled sideways. The bear's body slid forward another inch toward the hole, her claws scrabbling wildly. No, 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 no. I threw my shoulder into her again, using what leverage I had to stop her slide. My muscles screamed from the strain. I could feel the heat through her fur, the panic shaking her entire body. The remaining boards under her back legs bowed so deeply I could see daylight through the new cracks spreading along their length. We were out of time. I dug my heels in, braced my free hand on a cable, and spoke out loud even though she could not understand. "If we stay here, we both go down." The river roared in response, drowning out everything else. I reached behind me, grabbed the loose end of the rope I had tied around her chest, and looped it under my right arm. Then I leaned my entire weight backward, pulling as hard as I could. For a second, nothing happened. She was too heavy, too frightened, too unstable. Then her hind legs slipped. Both planks beneath them snapped clean through with a violent pop. Her back end dropped, and her full weight slammed into the rope and into me. The breath punched out of my lungs. The bridge tilted so fast that the sky swung sideways. I felt my boots leave the wood. The safety rope on my harness jerked tight, catching me mid-fall. Pain shot across my ribs as the strap dug in. I dangled for a second, legs kicking over the open air. The bear hung from my rope, her chest against the edge of the broken span, her weight nearly dragging me down with her. "Hold on, Owen. Do not let go." I clawed at the nearest plank, found an edge, and hauled myself back up, scraping my forearms raw. The bear groaned, trying to lift herself, but the old research harness around her body snagged on a broken board, holding her at a brutal angle. "Stay still. I am going to pull you up." My voice cracked. I was not sure if I was talking to her or to myself. With both hands wrapped around the rope, I leaned back again. My boots dug deep into the grooves of the remaining plank. The cables above us creaked in long, drawn-out moans. The bear's front paws found a small ledge of wood still clinging to the frame. She pressed into it, not climbing yet, but shifting enough to give me a moment of upward movement. That was the only opening I would get. I pulled hard, harder than I had ever pulled anything in my life. My arms burned. My back screamed. The rope sliced across my gloves. Slowly, painfully, her upper body lifted a few inches. The edge dug into her ribs, but she kept pressing forward. The cub's cries rose in pitch, pushing her instinct harder than my strength ever could. "Come on, come on." Her right paw caught another plank. She hauled herself an inch more, then another. The weight in the rope eased just enough for me to reposition, shifting my stance to the last reliable board. One more pull, one more. I anchored the rope against the cable, leaned back with everything I had, and felt her body rise one last time before her chest came over the frame and landed on solid wood. She collapsed forward, panting hard, her legs trembling. I fell to my knees beside her, letting the rope go slack for the first time. We were still on a broken bridge, still too close to the drop, still without backup. But she was no longer hanging over the void. For the first time since stepping onto the bridge, I let myself breathe. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The bear lay slumped on the last stretch of boards that still held, sides heaving, head low. My legs felt like water, but the bridge was far from safe. One wrong shift from her, or one more broken plank, and we would be in trouble all over again. "All right, girl. We have to get you off this thing," she answered with a weak groan. It was not pain, not exactly, more exhaustion and confusion. She kept glancing toward the canyon, toward the distant cries of her cubs. They were still calling, their voices echoing off the rock walls, thin and uneven. They had no idea how close they were to losing her. I tightened the slack in the rope still looped around her chest, careful not to startle her. The knot held. My harness creaked as I shifted my weight and guided her to turn toward the stable end of the bridge. "Come on. This way." slow and steady. She pushed up onto trembling legs. The boards under us flexed dangerously, but they did not give. Every step she took made the cables above groan. I walked backward, facing her, one hand on the rope, the other on the guide cable. Inch by inch, we made progress. When we reached the first fully solid plank, I finally let out a breath I had been holding for what felt like an hour. The ground at the end of the bridge was only a few steps away. Go on. Almost there. She stepped onto solid dirt, paused, then swung her head toward the canyon again, listening for the cubs. They cried out, but distance and the echoing walls made it hard for her to lock onto the direction. She turned twice in a small circle, snorting and groaning, confused. Easy. They are up there. We just have to go around. I pointed toward the slope on our side of the canyon. There was an old service trail carved into the hillside 3 decades ago, still passable if you were careful. It looped around the northern ridge and connected to the opposite side of Dry Creek about 1.5 miles up. The cubs kept calling. Her ears twitched toward the sound, but she stayed frozen, stuck between fear and instinct. I unhooked the rope from her chest, stepping carefully so she would not mistake the movement for a threat. For a moment she stared at me, breathing hard, her eyes still wide from the ordeal. Go find them. I will guide you. Just keep moving. She let out a long, low moan and took a few steps in the direction I pointed. She did not trust me. She simply had no other path. The sun had started its drop behind the western ridge, turning the canyon orange. Shadows stretched long across the trail ahead. I knew we had maybe an hour before real darkness set in. We started up the incline. The service trail was narrow in some places, washed out in others. I kept 10 or 12 feet between us, close enough to guide her, but far enough to avoid triggering a defensive response. Every few minutes, she paused to listen. The cubs' cries were faint but constant. Halfway up the slope, a sudden rustle in the brush made us both freeze. A shape, a lanky, cautious one, moved between the trees. A coyote. It spotted the bear first, then me, and stopped dead. For a few seconds, none of us moved. Then it ducked its head and trotted off in a wide arc, wanting no part of what it had walked into. The bear huffed, as if annoyed rather than frightened, and kept walking. My pulse, however, took much longer to settle. As we climbed higher, the trail narrowed to a single rocky shelf carved out of the slope. The bear hesitated, glancing at the drop below. I knew she was exhausted and unsteady, but backing down now would take us into thicker brush where mountain lions sometimes hunted at dusk. You can do this, just a little farther. She placed one giant paw on the shelf, then another. Rocks tumbled down the slope below, clattering against the canyon wall. I moved slowly behind her, hands out to steady myself. When we reached the bend, the sound of the cubs grew sharper. Her ears shot up. She lifted her head high, sniffing the air. There you go. You hear them now. She rumbled deep in her chest and picked up her pace. Branches snapped under her weight as she pushed through the last thicket of brush. Then, at the crest of the ridge, 2 small shapes appeared, dark, frantic, stumbling toward her. She stopped, making a soft, low call I had not heard before. The cubs answered instantly, running straight for her. They collided with her legs, whining and snorting, climbing over her paws. The bear lowered her head and nudged them gently, rumbling with relief. I stood several yards back, chest tight, sweat cold on my neck. For the first time since the call that morning, I felt something other than fear. She had her cubs again, and I still had to make it back before dark. A week later, the mountains felt different. Same trails, same cold air rolling off the canyon walls, same smell of pine and dust, but something in me had shifted. I told myself I was coming back to check the condition of the bridge, to file a proper report, to make sure no one else wandered onto something that unstable. But deep down I knew why I was really here. I needed to see it with my own eyes. Needed to confirm that the moment on that broken span had not been luck alone. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived. Not a single car in the turnout. A breeze pushed through the treetops, carrying the faint rush of the river hidden far below. I took a slow breath, tightened my jacket, and started up the same path I had run a week earlier with adrenaline burning through my veins. The climb felt longer this time. Maybe because my legs were still carrying the memory of fear. Maybe because I kept replaying the sound of the boards snapping under her weight, or the way the rope cut into my hands. When the trees finally opened and the old suspension bridge came into view, I stopped. There was no bridge anymore. The center span was gone completely. The cables that once held it dangled in loose arcs, twisted like brittle vines. The few remaining planks lay scattered on the rocks at the bottom of the canyon, broken into pale splinters. If we had been on that bridge just a few minutes later, both of us would be down there. The thought made my throat tighten. I stepped closer to the edge, careful not to disturb the ground near the collapsed frame. Nothing about what I had done felt heroic now. It felt fragile, like I had threaded a needle with shaking hands and somehow come out whole. I crouched and touched one of the frayed cables still clinging to the post. It crumbled under my fingers. No one could cross here again. Not an animal, not a person. Maybe that was for the best. A rustle behind me made me freeze. I turned slowly, expecting a deer or maybe another hiker I had not heard approach. But it was neither. A dark shape stepped out from between the trees, heavy and deliberate. Then another, much smaller. And a third. My chest lifted in a quiet breath I did not realize I had been holding. The mother bear stood at the edge of the clearing, her fur catching the dim morning light. She looked healthier than the last time I saw her, steadier on her legs, calmer. The two cubs pressed close to her sides, their noses twitching as they sniffed the air. She watched me with the same stillness she had shown on the bridge right before everything fell apart. No fear, no aggression, just awareness. Recognition? Maybe that was pushing it. Bears remember danger, food, and scent. They do not form gratitude the way people do. But she did not turn away. One of the cubs chirped softly and stepped forward, only a foot or two, before the mother nudged it back with her muzzle. Then she lifted her head, looked at me for a long, silent moment, and gave a single low huff. Not a warning, not a threat, something closer to acknowledgement. Then she turned, guiding the cubs toward the trees. They disappeared slowly, not in a rush, just moving on with their lives, leaving the canyon quiet again. I stood there until the last rustle of brush faded. The breeze shifted, carrying the river's roar back to me. For the first time in days, the memory of the bridge did not feel like a weight. It felt like a reminder. Sometimes you step into something terrifying and you come out changed. Not because you were brave, but because you had no choice and still kept moving. I took one more look at the empty gap where the bridge used to be, then turned down the trail. The mountains behind me breathed in the morning light, and I let the quiet settle where the fear used to sit. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories. And now just click the playlist or the next video on your screen.